Facing an aggressive opponent is uncomfortable, but what can be even more uncomfortable is an aggressive opponent who is constantly overbetting. What can you do when you're in tough spots all the time and don't want to fold away your money, but also don't want to pay your opponent off when you have a marginal hand? Well, who would be a better role model to learn from than the end boss LLinusLLove, who is facing some pressure from notorious overbetter Stefan Burakov, aka Stefan11222. In this hand, Linus opens the button with aces and gets called by Stefan. Linus decides to check back the flop. After facing another check from Stefan on the turn, he also checks back the turn. On the river, Stefan throws in a 30% block bet. After having played deceptively on the previous streets, Linus goes for a value raise with his aces. However, Stefan goes ahead and does Stefan things. Raise. Big. In Linus's shoes, how do we make a decision here? Well, even if we may not be a GTO wizard like him, we can still use GTO Wizard for studying.
Yeah, that was corny.
Recreating the line of the hand, we can see that according to the GTO solution, aces are indeed checked back some amount of the time on the flop. 35% for this combo. The small blind isn't doing too bad on this flop. But having a bunch of high cards that want to check back and realize their equity against a pretty large amount of check raises from the big blind, we want to protect our checking range by checking back some high pocket pairs as well. On the turn, the big blind will mostly bet his strong hands. So a lot of their checking range will consist of absolute air hands. Against these, aces don't need protection, but in contrast want them to catch up. If they make a pair on the river or decide to bluff, we'll gain much more than by just having them check fold the turn. Now on the river, Stefan's range mostly wants to bet small, just like he actually did. There are still some nutty hands as well as complete air included, but most of these hands are low, medium and top pair hands, and even some ace highs, going for thin value. Against that range, aces are an easy raise. Alongside other slow played overpairs, trips, and river top pairs. Now, Stefan's actual 3-bet sizing isn't included in this solution, but the according range will most likely be something in between these two sizings, which are an all-in and a raise to 19 big blinds, which would be $3,800 in this hand. Following the GTO solution, that range includes trip 5s to 100%, sets and straights, and ace highs as bluffs. And against both the 19 big blind raise as well as the shove, aces end up being a very slim bluff catcher, with Linus's combo favoring calling. While aces block Stefan's ace-4 straights, they also block his main bluffs, which should be ace high according to the solution. However, there are still some very small amounts of random trash hands left that are bluffing, which leads to Linus's aces being a profitable call in theory. If you also want to take your game to the next level and use GTO Wizard for studying GTO lines, bet sizings, and range distributions in all kinds of spots with practically no waiting time, make sure to get 10% off your first payment by clicking on the link in the description. Before we see what happened in the hand, let's double the stakes and move up to a 200-400 hand. Stefan opens the button, Linus calls and the flop goes check check again. After tanking for a while, Linus decides not to bet his nut flush draw on the turn. Instead, he faces a 75% pot bet from Stefan and check calls. He doesn't river a flush, but a mere pair of eights. And since it was so fun, Stefan pumps out another overbet. Looking at the GTO solution, checking back the flop would be Stefan's play around 50% of the time, basically mixing most hand classes. On the turn, Linus would be betting a little less than half the time. Mostly strong hands like straights, sets, 2-pair and some top pairs as well as total air, while low pairs and king highs mostly check. And even though it is being checked around 10% of the time, his actual hand, King 8 of clubs, clearly prefers betting. Facing the check, Stefan would then favor a small bet in theory. This would allow him to not only bet nut hands like straights, sets and 2-pair, but also top pairs and even lower ones like 5x and 4x. His in-game sizing is barely used and much more polarized, consisting of 2x straights, sets, some underpairs and then pure air. Against this range, King 8 of clubs is an easy call, as it's not only drawing to the nuts, but also ahead of Stefan's air part of his range. As it's already polarized on the turn, and there is no point in betting some of the medium strength hands on the river, his betting range will now be nuts, 2-pair plus, or a nothing, which is the perfect condition for an overbet sizing. Facing this sizing, Linus has to think about which hands he now wants to defend. When facing an overbet and therefore a polarized range, you are mostly sitting on a range full of bluff catchers, all of which beat your opponent's bluffs, but lose against their value hands. So making a decision doesn't depend on the absolute strength of your hand, but much more on the blocking effect. You can block your opponent's value hands, in this case that would be blocking 2-pair and sets by having a pair yourself. You can't block their straights however, as having a 2 simply makes you have a straight as well. So besides blocking value hands, you also want to think about unblocking bluffs.
Jones will get a big hole. Jones gets...
By choosing the right combos to call, you are allowing your opponent to have more bluffs in their range and thus shifting their relative amount of value hands. We can see this effect if we look at the calling hands in Linus' spot. Even though Ace-6 and Ace-7 are better hands than King 8 in an absolute sense, they are mostly folded, whereas King 8 is a pure call. This is because the 6 and the 7 block some of Stefan's most frequent bluffs, which would be 10-6, 10-7, Jack-6, Jack-7, and Queen-6, Queen-7. King High, however, is not bluffed in his shoes, so Linus' King 8 doesn't block any bluffs. So the next time you are facing an overbet, or just a big bet when you have a bluff catcher, think about whether you block value and or unblock bluffs. And if your opponent is capable of bluffing, base your decision on your hand's blocking ability. And independent of that, always remember, whether you are making the correct call in the long run or not, sometimes you will lose, and sometimes you will win. If you want to learn more about overbets and how to use them yourself, check out this video next.